Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I'll be your webinar moderator today. Our speaker today is Tom Guan. Tom is an Assistant Director at the Department of Infrastructure, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts, and works on delivering the National Heavy Vehicle Charging Pilot. He has a keen interest in heavy vehicles, transport, economic pricing, and transport technology. Specifically, Tom has been involved in designing the telematics concepts and alternative mass distance heavy vehicle charging models to be used in phase 3 of the pilot trials. Tom has over a decade of experience in the public service and has held numerous policy and regulatory roles within the department, covering communications, transport security, and modeling the future of transport. Like always, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question, please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session. So welcome everyone, and over to you, Tom.
Sorry about that. I was just on mute. Thank you, Michelle, for the kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Great to be here to present to all of you about the National Heavy Vehicle Charging Pilot and update you on some of the progress, as well as our plans for the major phase 3 telematics trial that's going to be coming up soon. And hopefully we want to get as many participants as possible to really test some of the modeling and thinking that we've got for potentially alternative charges of heavy vehicle charging. So what I wanted to cover today is a bit of background on where we've come up with the project, what we are currently working on, but also I'm keen to hear on some of your thoughts and happy to answer any questions about the way that we are planning to progress our heavy vehicle trials, as well as the technologies that we're using, because there is quite a broad range of different vehicles I'm sure that you're aware of in Australia, and that we're trying to capture a system, a national system that would test a distance-based charging scheme. So just going through, sorry about that. The National Heavy Vehicle Charging Pilot. So essentially, this project is a Commonwealth initiative that's been started a couple of years ago and is tied into the heavy vehicle road reforms that I think one of the questions that we received earlier. What we're essentially trying to do is to look for an alternative way to reform the current heavy vehicle charges. Now, really in a nutshell, the current charging system relies on two components. One, which is the state-based registration, state and territory registration. So that's a fixed cost that's being paid on the prime mover, the trailers. And then there's an additional fuel excise, which is charged per litre. So the fuel excise is an attempt to act as a proxy for a direct user-based charge. It's not entirely accurate to how much the vehicle and the impact it's doing to the road, and we'll discuss some of that later. What essentially we're trying to do in this project is to take some of the theories and the modeling that we've done, as well as lessons from international jurisdictions, and look at, is there a better way for government to charge heavy vehicles that would also work in a better way for industry? So we're moving towards a system where heavy vehicle charges are more reflective of use, instead of a system where it's got a large fixed component and has a fuel excise that may or may not reflect the actual usage and the wear and tear of the vehicle on the road. So in this process, in this project, I've been working on it for a couple of years, and we've learned some key facts through working with industry, and the importance of getting individual operators as well as peak bodies and industry groups involved in this project to really understand what your thoughts are, how this impacts individual operators even on a per vehicle basis. So for example, would a potential alternative charge be better off for an individual class of vehicles or potentially for a different industry. So continuing on this project, we would like to work very closely with industry and to get some of that key data and share that data back to you in terms of our analysis on how a new potential system would work. So a little bit about what we are trying to collect through the National Heavy Vehicle Pilot. Essentially, at this stage, we're running a couple of trials, and the main focus is to collect 2 or 3 key aspects of your operations. So this involves most important is probably distance, because as I'll go into a little bit later, what we are trying to model is a charge that moves away from the fuel excise-based charge into a distance-based charge. So we're really looking to collect data from vehicles operators on distance. Now, one of the most easiest ways to do that is a manual method, just to simply provide us with an approximation or with a sheet stating that your particular vehicle has traveled so many kilometers in a particular month. But the more sophisticated ways that we're trying to capture this data is through using telematics, as well as some manual devices such as hobodometers. And so that's one component of what we're trying to do in this particular trial. The other information that we like to capture is the current fuel consumption that your vehicles particularly use, that operators use, because that will allow us to compare how much you're actually currently paying in the current PAYGO fuel excise charges, and we'll be able to show you how a distance charge could potentially change once we remove that fuel excise under a new model. So a couple of other things that are involved in this trial is the actual technology. And I think as we talk to different operators, we're getting a feel that there's a kind of a diversity in terms of uptake of different telematics devices among operators. And so we like to actually test that out as to how feasible is it to use telematics for the purposes of a distance-based charge, noting that currently telematics themselves are being used in other regulatory functions and safety functions. And so one thing I want to reiterate is that all the data that we collect through this project is only for the use of policy development and specifically focused on the heavy vehicle trials to test an alternative scheme. So the data will remain confidentiality, and any participants that do sign up to the trials will be required to sign confidentiality agreements as well. So a brief history of where the pilot originated and where we're seeing likely to go ahead. So the pilot was announced a couple of years ago. We went through several stages of research and development, and in 2019 we ran a 6-month proof of trial. So that was with 12 operators across Australia, where we simply collected telematics data as well as some forms of manual data, so distance-based spreadsheets, and we were able to generate mock invoices which showed potentially what a future charging scheme may look like for operators. And so the idea of the mock invoice is to really show transparently how much individual operators will pay for each of their vehicles when you factor in under a distance-based charge, as well as how does that compare to the current registration and fuel excise charges. Throughout that, we've been working on further evaluation and recruitment. We've got around now about 40 heavy vehicle participants, heavy vehicle operators that are participating in the next 2 series of trials. And we're looking to start next year on our phase 3 trial, which is a major telematics-based trial for the heavy vehicle pilot. So just to capture that in a diagram format, you'll see on the screen here that we did some initial testing on the phase 1, which is to look at how we can better present a mock invoice, how to set up some of the data needs. Currently, we've launched a phase 2, which is a manual type trial, and I'll cover a little bit of that later in the next slide. So that involves the use of hobodometers to track distance, and we're also testing a mock permit system through that process with participants. The next phase, phase 3, which is probably where I'll spend most of the time today talking about, is the telematics-based trial. So that really captures several key data points: distance, location, fuel, and potentially even weight, but also the vehicle configuration. As the vehicle changes configuration, we're hoping to track that, and how does that impact the actual distance-based charge? Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to model here is the impact of a particular vehicle as it uses Australian roads. And so it is very important for us to try and capture as close as possible to the actual impact, different axle weights, different configurations, different loads, are what they're meaning for potential heavy vehicle distance-based charging. So that's some of the more sophisticated elements of using telematics in the trial. And one of the things that we will be doing is we're currently working through a procurement process to basically acquire and procure telematics systems for the use of our trial participants in the trial. And that we see running for about 12 months. So to really get some of that data through each single month, where we can share that with you and to provide findings back to government at the conclusion of these trials. So just want to cover now on the phase 2, which is the manual option here. So this is really where we've currently implemented this with our participants on the basis of providing a tool, which is a hobodometer, and that tries to capture as the vehicle travels. We work with the participants on a monthly basis to ask them how much has the vehicle traveled, and potentially what does that mean for a potential distance charging. So in the first section of the screen, you'll see that what we try to cover is very clearly that the current PAYGO system is showing you approximately how much a particular vehicle is traveling with their registration and with the fuel excise. And then the second part is where we want to highlight a potential distance-based charging system using the hobodometer permit system. All of the numbers here are only for presentation purposes. They're not actually the numbers that are potentially used in the actual distance-based charging. So I'll cover a little bit on the actual charge rates a bit later. We have one of the questions that talk about that. So it's a simple system, and what we're trying to build here is to sort of get industry to think a little bit differently about how they may pay for a future system. If it's a prepaid permit system, then they could prepay the kilometers and then refill those kilometers, instead of doing the current system where you're paying a registration system and then you're going to the Bowser and you're paying the fuel excise on top of the diesel price. And this is just another slide where we're trying to show how would a mock permit system potentially work electronically as well as a paper-based system. So we're undertaking that current phase 2 process, and we'll be keen to share some of the findings on the implementation and the practical elements of the permit-based system. All right, I'll just see if I might just pause there to just, there has been a question about the territory registration. So, yep, so I might just pause there as to this question. So the participant attendee asked, the rego reduction used in the example is a reduction to state or territory revenue. Are states on board with this approach? This is a great question. So what we're trying to do now is we have a frequent trial working group with each of the state transport agencies and road managers. But that also points to the fact that, yeah, we do have to get on board and work with all of the states, because that is a core component of any reform. Is to first, we need to reform the registration part, as well as to reform the fuel excise component, which is currently currently managed by the tax office. So that's where we see these trials are then preempting the discussions on those future points. All right, so in terms of phase 3, which is probably where we are focusing most of our energy in the section, is to look at the telematics based model charging systems. So one thing that we are trying to do here is the telematics that we are entering into procurement with the suppliers, we're keen to test them out on any participant vehicles that wish to have these new devices on. But we're also quite aware that a lot of operators already have telematics devices. And so in that circumstance, all we need to do is to use our data provider. We have a data contractor to access that potential data. And so there won't be any interruption. You won't be needing to put new devices on if you don't want that to be installed. So those are a couple of the options that we'll work with our trial participants. But essentially what we're trying to do is the telematics devices are installed. They supply the data back to our data analysts within the department, and our contractor will be able to generate a mock invoice based on a distance charge. And so what does that actually look like? A mock invoice that we've sort of honed over the years is presented here on the left side, and similar to the mock permit system in the odometers trial, we have the PAYGO system where we're showing you how much the vehicle is currently traveling. So what we really want to highlight here through the mock invoice system is to demonstrate that heavy vehicle operators on a monthly basis, how much they are being charged just alone on heavy vehicle charges. There are some complications to these calculations. So for example, there are insurance costs that we have to cut out from this. So what we're trying to really show is that how much of this cost is directly attributable to heavy vehicle charging on the roads. So registration and the fuel excise calculations. The fuel excise number there you see is $0.26 per litre. That's taking into account the actual rebate that's being taken off as you go through with the ATO process. In this process, what the calculations are based on is on travel on public roads. And similarly, with our distance-based model, we're only counting the distance traveled on public roads. So on part B, you'll see below that the distance-based model using telematics here, we have different charge rates for specific vehicles. So in a very simple way of looking at it, lighter vehicles will be charged less and heavier vehicles will be charged more. It's a very rough explanation of the distance-based charge, but we're also in the same moment working on the drive charging table where the vehicle's axles, the quality of the vehicle and any other features that may impact the damage on the road will be put in and will be calculated as a distance-based charge. So these numbers, again, I just provided as example, but they sort of make sense as to the heavier the vehicle, we're expecting a more larger distance-based charge. And so what we do here is that we calculate the total charge for you, and we'll give you a number here. We'll give you a number for comparison purposes. And different vehicles will potentially see lower or higher charges. And that was definitely the result that we saw in the small scale trials, we saw that different operators had varying degrees of changes when they went from a fuel-based current pay-go system to a distance-based charging. Critically, what we are trying to map out in this process is different charge rates and a different roadmap on how different metropolitan long-haul livestock vehicles can generate unique data, because they'll be very different when we attribute different travel patterns. As a vehicle that travels a lot, how will they fare under a distance-based charge versus a vehicle that might not be used? Potentially trailers that might not be used sitting in the yard, if they're currently paying registration, and when they go down to a distance-based model, how would that look for a particular operator? So essentially, that's where the project is at. We are currently in the final processes of trying to get that procurement sorted, where we're onboarding a data provider as well as telematics providers, so that we can have these systems installed in trial participants, gather that data and generate the invoices. Where do we go from those invoices? Well, we want to work with individual operators to share with them and to talk them through the changes that they are seeing under alternative scheme. And we've been doing this since the small scale trial, being asking questions on potentially, why are my vehicles being charged more? How does this make sense? Or, we've got feedback as well saying, this may provide better flexibility for my business if potentially we pay less of a registration charge on trailers and just use a distance-based, a user-based charge on trailers and components that we may not use frequently in a year. So those are some of the key questions and the key insights that we want to gain. But we also want to see from a broader national perspective, as many participants as we can get in different industries to participate in the trial. So great. I might just go over now to some of the pre-questions that we've received from members. The first one here is, when will draft rates table be provided to participants on what will be tested? How much per kilometers, i.e. how much per kilometer by vehicle configuration and weight, and calculated how? We're working on that right now to try and get those draft tables done up. But for reference, we can share some of the very general data charges that we've been using in the small scale trial. So I think what we can do is, if you can send me an email to the address above there, we can look at sharing some of the small scale trials, but noting that we are still refining those numbers. What we're trying to do is, because we're introducing a lot of new configurations and configuration changes and weights, we're not ready to provide those final numbers to the trial participants as of yet. But as I've talked about generally, we're looking at trying to match that very closely to the impact that the vehicles have on the road. So the second question, thinking about the end outcomes of the national pilot project, what practical advice or helpful steps can you give to road freight operators? Like what to start doing now and to get ready for any changes. So the end goal of the national pilot project is to look at a way of reforming the current charging system to a better system that will provide a more transparent and efficient way of charging for heavy vehicle operators, as well as to address some of the the trends that we are seeing in the industry, where potentially fuel excise revenue is projected to decline due to uptake of more fuel efficient vehicles and electric vehicles. So in order to really inform any move to a potential charge, and government hasn't made any decision on changing the current system, we'll need to provide the evidence base to inform government of whether to proceed with any changes and how we would go about those changes. So what we really like to see road operators, in fact, in this particular session, we would like to see as many operators join up to the trial, not so that they can not just because that this will give them an opportunity to test some of the new telematics devices that we're trying to test, but also give you the opportunity to provide feedback. So what we'll want to see, even positive, negative feedback or suggestions on how we can run the trials, what the charge rates, what they mean for you. I think those are really important for us to understand. And that really will prepare you ready for any potential charges, changes down the road. So getting involved is probably the key message I like to get across to everyone today, is to understand how the system currently works and potentially be in the conversation as to how we want to change for the future. All right, so the last question, the HVR is heavy vehicle road reform, which is another project that's being run by the department. It's currently actually running in my colleague's team, so just go through that. The HVR timeline is unclear. When is it proposed to put reform proposals together for consideration by government? Proposals that drawn on the trials? Will industry get to see these proposals in draft? So I've spoken with my colleague in the HVR team, and we'll have to get back to you on that particular question. And so I'll send through the contact details to Michelle, and we'll get that question back to you as soon as possible. So that's all the pre-session questions that I've tried to answer, and please let me know that if you need any further information so we can go over that again. I'll just have a look at the Q&A from our attendees. So as one of our attendees mentioned, why wouldn't you just copy the RUX system from New Zealand? Again, that's exactly the way that we've sort of done the hub odometer system. We've attempted to learn some lessons from the New Zealand system in that manual system. One of the other issues that we are trying to employ here is the telematics and the configuration-based system. So anecdotally, from what New Zealand systems have done, is that because they've charged different configurations on the different trailers, we're looking to see if we can do the same. And we're in the talks with New Zealand as well as other international counterparts to look at bringing that. The tricky part here about just taking the New Zealand system is that the distance and the industry involved is slightly different over there to what we've got here. So we've got issues with a lot of remote and long distance, long haul operators that we want to try and get the best data as possible from that. Just to sort of cap off on that, there's others. What we're trying to look for is in our work with our technology providers, we're trying to find out, can we provide a tailored solution to the Australian environment where we don't see that elsewhere? So one of the issues here is a lot of vehicles here change configurations. So from a semi-trailer to a B double. And what we really want to focus on in the phase 3 telematics trial is to how do we actually accurately capture that data and assign a distance-based charge on the different configurations. Okay, so I don't see any, happy to answer any questions that come through now, and otherwise, please email us at the National Pilot. In terms of actual sign up, we do have officers in the team that will work with you one-on-one on the actual process of participating in the trial. So the actual trials that are happening in phase 3, what they essentially involve is, if you do have telematics devices, we'll arrange for data operators to tap into that system. So there should be very minimal administrative burden for operators to participate in the trial. What you will receive is the invoice on a monthly basis, and you'll be able to see how your vehicles fit. So you'll nominate a couple of vehicles, we'll get the data from those vehicles. If you do want telematics devices installed, then there's an option for that as well. So as I mentioned, we're still working with our procurement team to get that sorted. But otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for your time, and happy to answer questions. And thank you, Michelle, for arranging me to speak to your members today.
Great, thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for attending. So you have the National Pilot email there, but you can also send questions to info@natroad.com.au and we can pass it on to Tom. Today's webinar will be uploaded to the NatRoad website, so please share with your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.